engineering in the lack of Jews hired. And there were 8 Jews hired at the same time there. We went with only one temple, and I went to the same temple, and there became this group of engineers. And one of them was Arnie's brother that we found out many years later. Arnie's, as in Arnie's, it was a relative of mine.
Well, I'm getting my excitement back about learning.
The last thing I'll say about this, and then I do have to move on, is that if you are a Jew and you go to a synagogue anywhere in the world, if you know Hebrew, you can worship anywhere in the world. If you only know your language, you isolate yourself.
See, that was
There's a universalism to it.
Touche.
So when I was in Geneva, when I was in Ukraine, whatever it is, I don't understand the sermon, but I understand everything else. So, okay, friends, we are moving now into our ideology and allegory. We are shifting gears completely to looking at what we would call the succession of leadership, namely prophetic succession. Now, the reason why I am bringing this to you, take care, Jen. The reason why I'm bringing this to you is because, one, I think it's a fascinating lesson, but also because very few congregants, in my experience, get access to texts outside of the Pentateuch. In other words, Joshua, Judges, Kings, Samuel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, there's virtually none, save a Haftorah thing, reading or whatever. In other words, there's a whole world inside this section of our Tanakh. Everyone reads the Psalms, they're great, whatever, but the monarchy and all these sort of prophetic ideas and things like that are just not taught. And so I want to start this three-part session with prophetic legacy and that sort of stuff in terms of looking at Joshua, who is Moses' successor, and then paralleling that with Elijah and Elisha. Most people know Elijah the prophet. Most people have not heard of Elisha the prophet, Elijah's successor. So I wanted to, that's how we're going to move into this. We're going to look at the idea of prophetic succession, meaning when one prophet dies, another one takes its place in Judaism, in this idea, in biblical stories in Judaism. We're going to see some of that parallelism as well. So what I'd like to do first is have someone read for me the concept of prophetic succession, which is laid out quite clearly in Deuteronomy 18:15 through 18:22. In other words, the Deuteronomic authors, the writers, had ideas about this, and they wanted to put that down in their book. So if someone wants to read that on the first page. Andre, sure, please.
Yahweh your God will raise up for you a prophet from among your own people like myself. Him you shall hear. This is just what you asked of Yahweh God at Horeb on the day of the assembly, saying, let me not hear the voice of Yahweh my God any longer, or see this wondrous fire anymore, lest I die. When at a point Yahweh said to me, they have done well in speaking thus. I will raise up a prophet for them from among their own people like yourself.
Okay, pause for just a moment there. Thank you. A prophet like yourself, okay? The envisioned future prophet is not necessarily like Moses in stature, obviously, because they believe Moses to be the greatest, okay? But in function. The function of a prophet is the intermediary between Israel and God. someone who hears God's words and then transmits to them. Okay, so he's saying, I will raise up a prophet from among their own people like you, like Moses. Not as great as Moses, but the same function. Okay, keep going.
I will put my words in his mouth, and he will speak to them all that I command him. And if anybody fails to heed the words he speaks in my name, I myself will call him to account. But any prophet who presumes to speak in my name an oracle that I did not command him to utter, or who speaks in the name of other gods, that prophet shall die. And should you ask yourselves how can you know that the oracle was not spoken by Yahweh? If the prophet speaks in the name of Yahweh and the oracle does not come true, that oracle was not spoken by Yahweh. The prophet has uttered it presumptuously. Do not stand in dread of him.
Okay, there's a lot of stuff like this in Deuteronomy, like if there's a sorcerer or whatever, like, don't believe him unless this, right? Okay, you have to make sure, because there's lots of people going around saying that they're prophets and that they're sorcerers and they're oracles and stuff like that. And so what the Deuteronomist is trying to do is say, like, look, this is the formula for ours. This is how you recognize it, okay? The reason why I wanted to, of course, point out, the reason why we're using Yahweh, okay, is because that is our fake sort of pronunciation of the Yod He Vav He, the unpronounceable name of God that occurs in the Torah. Okay, we don't know how it's pronounced, and I don't want us to say in this class we don't say things like Adonai and that sort of stuff, because I want to remove that theological implication out. I want us to just read the text. So
Where does Yeshem come from?
Hashem means the name. So it's the Orthodox version of Adonai, basically. It's just like a placeholder for this as well. Okay? So, really interesting to mention is that the Torah actually never officially calls Moses a prophet. He's called a prophet later, but the Torah never calls him a prophet. The only thing close is in Deuteronomy 34:10, which it says there was never again a prophet like Moses. That is sort of the closest it gets, right? I mean, that's kind of comparing him to one, but he's never outright called one, okay? He's called God's minister, or a man of God, or something like that. So that's just something to mention, okay? And there's a great deal of depth in that sort of idea, is that what Moses' role was he a prophet, was he a prophet king, was he this thing in between? But for the purpose of this study, we are going to see him as a prophet. The prophet, as we read in 18:15, Yahweh your God will raise you up from a prophet, right? The prophet is established by God, okay? Resembles Moses not in looks or in grandeur, but in function, and should be listened to at all costs. Basically, him you shall heed, right? When a prophet arrives, this is your guy, okay? The conduit of divine speech, okay? The prophet transmits inspired language to an audience stipulated by God. Really important, as I remind us in our class over and over again, that the prophet and the idea of prophecy isn't necessarily the colloquial idea of prophecy that we think of today, of predicting the future. The prophecy is the conduit of God's language and God's form into a person, right? The intermediary is what we're talking about here. Certainly they did make prophecies, but that's not quite what we're talking about here. Interesting that that was read, if the prophet speaks in the name of Yahweh and the oracle does not come true, the oracle was not spoken by Yahweh. In other words, the criteria of the language is how you determine whether the prophet is true or false. If it comes true, it's a prophet. If it's false, it's not a prophet. Okay, that's how we determine it. So if someone arises as a prophet, you're not sure if they're a prophet unless they say this is going to happen, and it happens. Okay? So prophetic legacy, okay? Really fascinating is the names of the two prophets that we're going to talk about, Joshua and Elijah. Okay, in the Hebrew, Yoshua and Eliyahu and Elisha. They come from the same root, the Hebrew root of Yud, Shin, Ayin, which, and Jules, you're like this, means he redeems. Okay? So we're talking about the more theological redemption, not redemption of the captives here. We're talking about the he redeems. Okay, so again, there's always stuff in the names. Okay, so we've got a couple moments to discuss here. Just as Moses is never specifically told or called a prophet, Joshua has some interesting names as well. He occurs as Moses' apprentice or attendant. So let's take a look at some of these texts. If someone wants to read a few of these, Exodus 24, Exodus 33.
So Moses and his attendant Joshua arose, and Moses ascended the mountain.
Okay, his attendant, okay.
Yahweh would speak to Moses face to face, as one man spoke to another, and he would then return to the camp. But his attendant Joshua, son of Nun, a youth, would not stir out of the tent.
Okay. Numbers 11, someone want to read that?
And Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' attendant from his youth, spoke up and said, "My lord Moses, restrain them." Joshua 1:1. After the death of Moses, the servant Yahweh said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' attendant.
Okay, so again, we're not, the word prophet, not necessarily there. Moses is a man of God, God's minister, and this guy, Joshua, is Moses' apprentice or attendant or whatever, some sort of thing there, okay? As we move over to Elijah, okay? And by the way, we're going to read in a moment, before we get into the type scene stuff, we're going to read some text so that we have some background, okay, on this, as to what's going on. Elijah the prophet, a very famous prophet. Elisha is his attendant, but he doesn't receive the title of prophet either. Israel's horseman and chariot. And Elijah, we know, is set to be the bringer of the Messianic age. We say Elijah, we wait for Elijah on Passover. At the end of Havdalah, the first thing we sing is Eliyahu Hanavi, the coming of Elijah, right? There's a lot of status here, okay? Elisha, anyone ever even heard of Elisha at this table? Right, exactly, right? And about Joshua, we know of him, but there's not, right? So the stature... Right, exactly, right. Jericho, all that, right. But the Torah ends with this huge death of Moses. There's never going to be someone, everyone knows Moses, right? And Elijah, we talk about all the time, but their successors, not so much, okay? But really quick, let's read about Elisha and Elijah here, where it says prophetic legacy.
Elisha, this is King 2:12. Elisha saw it and he cried out, "O Father, Father, Israel's chariots and horsemen." When he could no longer see him, he grasped his garments and rent them in two.
Okay.
Then in the next one, Elisha had been stricken with the illness of which he was to die, and King Joash of Israel went down to see him, wept over him, cried, "Father, Father, Israel's chariots and horsemen."
Right, he's not saying prophet, okay? He's saying, right, okay? Malachi, lo, I will send the prophet Elijah to you before the coming of the awesome, fearful day of Yahweh. He shall reconcile parents with children and children with their parents, so that when I come, I do not strike the whole land with utter destruction. Malachi 3:22. Be mindful of the teaching of my servant Moses, whom I charged with Horeb, with the laws and rules of all Israel. And Malachi 3:23. Lo, I will send a prophet Elijah to you before the coming of the awesome, fearful day of Yahweh. This is how the prophet section of our Tanakh ends. Highlights on Moses and Elijah. Joshua and Elisha, nothing. Okay?
All I remember about Elisha, that's really weird. story about a bear
Yeah.
that killed the boys.
Right. There's a great story about these boys who make fun of Elisha because he's bald and he sends bears to massacre them. It's a great little story. Yeah. It's a good, it's one of his first acts as a prophet. It's pretty cool. Gotta love those stories you don't really get to read. But yes, it would stick in the mind though, right? That one. So if you would, please pass over the pink section really quick. And let's do the text for the discussion in full, okay? So where it says text for discussion in full, we've got Numbers 27 through Joshua 1:2 that we're going to read together. And then on the back, you'll see 2 Kings 2:1 through 2 Kings 15. I want us to get the full section so that nobody's lost here, okay? So I'll begin because these texts that we're going to analyze are going to talk about the idea of prophetic succession. So the idea of the transfer from Moses to Joshua and the idea of Elijah to Elisha. So I want you to get a feel for this story, of it all. Okay? Everyone with me? Wonderful. Okay. Good. So Numbers 27. And Yahweh answered Moses, single out Joshua, son of Nun, an inspired man, and lay your hand upon him. Have him stand before Eleazar the priest and before the whole community, and commission him in their sight. Invest him with some of your authority, so that the whole Israelite community may obey. But he shall present himself to Eleazar the priest, who shall on his behalf seek the decision of the Urim, the oracle, before Yahweh. But such instruction they shall go out, and by instruction they shall come in, he and all the Israelites, the whole community. Okay? And we're going to tear these texts apart in just a moment, but I just want us to read through. And I'll read Numbers 27, and then I'll hand it over to one of you, please. Moses did as Yahweh commanded him. He took Joshua, had him stand before Eleazar the priest, and before the whole community he laid his hands upon him and commissioned him, as Yahweh had spoken through Moses. Okay? Someone would like to read Deuteronomy 34, 5 through 12. Bueller. Okay.
So Moses, the servant of Yahweh, died there, in the land of Moab, at the command of Yahweh. He buried him in the valley in the land of Moab, near Beth Peor, and no one knew his burial place to this day. Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eyes were undimmed and his vigour unabated. And the Israelites bewailed Moses in the steppes of Moab for 30 days. The period of wailing and mourning for Moses came to an end. Now Joshua, son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom, because Moses had laid his hands upon him, and the Israelites heeded him, doing as Yahweh had commanded Moses.
Keep going.
Going?
Yeah.
Never again did there arise in Israel a prophet like Moses, whom Yahweh singled out face to face, for the various signs and portents that Yahweh sent him to display in the land of Egypt against Pharaoh and all his courtiers and his whole country, and for all the great might and awesome power that Moses displayed before all Israel.
Wonderful. And again, we'll pull this apart in a moment. I just want us to get a sense of the story. Someone want to read Joshua 1:1 through 5, through those last 2 paragraphs.
And after the death of Moses, the servant of Yahweh, Yahweh said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' attendant, my servant Moses is dead. Prepare to cross the Jordan together with all this people into the land that I am going to the Israelites. Every spot on which your foot treads I give to you, as I promised Moses. Your territory shall extend from the wilderness and the Lebanon to the good river, the river Euphrates for the east, the whole Hittite country, and up the Mediterranean Sea on the west. No one shall be able to resist you as long as you live. As I with Moses, so I will with you. I will not fail you or forsake you.
Okay, so these are the scenes that we're going to sort of analyze in terms of moving from one prophet to another in terms of that story. Good? And we will go deep into this, okay? Turn the page if you would. I know that many of you probably are somewhat familiar with the numbers in the Deuteronomy, whatever it is, as we took a sort of survey before. Most of you have not heard this story at all of Elijah's death and Elisha taking over. So I want us to read this together before we start pulling it apart to say, okay, what the heck are we even talking about here, okay? This occurs in 2 Kings 2:1 through 2:15, and it's basically the end of Elijah's rule and then moving over into Elisha. This is what this captures, okay? And we'll give you some more depth in that as well. So someone want to read, no, on the very back, very back. Very back. Okay. Someone like to read that first paragraph, 2 Kings 2:1. Someone new.
When Yahweh was about to take Elijah up to heaven in a whirlwind, Elijah and Elisha had set out from Gilgal. Elijah said to Elisha, Stay here, for Yahweh has sent me on to Bethel. As Yahweh lives and as you live, said Elisha, I will not leave you. So they went down to Bethel. Disciples of the prophets at Bethel came out to Elisha, and they said to him, Do you know what? Yahweh will take your master away from you today. He replied, I know it, too. Be silent.
Wonderful. Someone else want to continue? 2:4.
And Elijah said to him, Elisha, stay here, for Yahweh has sent me on to Jericho. As Yahweh lives and as you live, said Elisha, I will not leave you. So they went on to Jericho. The disciplines of the prophets who were at Jericho came over to Elisha and said to him, Do you know that Yahweh will take your master away from you today? He replied, I know it too. Be silent.
Good. Someone else, 2 Kings 2:6. And while you're doing this, excuse me, I have to go get a cord to plug this in so it doesn't die. But don't worry, I know the story. Read it out loud.
Elijah said to him, Stay here, for Yahweh has sent me on to the Jordan. As Yahweh lives and as you live, I will not leave you, he said. And the two of them went on. 50 men of the disciples of the prophets followed and stood by at a distance from them, and the two of them stopped at the Jordan. Thereupon Elijah took his mantle and rolling it up, he struck the water. It divided to the right and left, so that the two of them crossed over on dry land. As they were crossing, Elijah said to Elisha, Tell me, what can I do for you before I am taken from you? Elisha answered, Let a double portion of your spirit pass on to me. You have asked a difficult thing, he said. If you see me as I am being taken from you, this will be granted to you. If not, it will not. As they kept on walking and talking, a fiery chariot with fiery horses suddenly appeared and separated one from the other. And Elijah went up to heaven in a whirlwind. Elisha saw it, and he cried out, O Father, Father, Israel's chariot and horsemen. When he could no longer see him, he grasped his garments and ran them in two.
Wonderful. And someone finish up here the end of this story here.
He picked up Elijah's mantle, which had been dropped from him, and he went back and stood on the bank of the Jordan. Taking the mantle which had dropped from Elijah, he struck the water and said, Where is Yahweh, the God of Elijah? As he too struck the water, it parted to the right and to the left, and Elisha crossed over it. When the disciples of the prophets at Jericho saw him from a distance, they exclaimed, The spirit of Elijah has settled on Elisha. And they went to meet him and bowed low before him to the ground. Okay,
thank you. So hopefully we can already start to see some connections between the passages that we've written, but we're going to that we've read. That we're going to go into them in a great deal of depth. So let's turn back, okay, to page 3, where it says type scene of prophetic succession. Okay. The lesson that I'll be teaching you is a lesson from Dr. Rachel Haverlock about her understanding of what we call a type scene of prophetic succession. She believes that 5 thematic elements can be spotted in a type scene of this type, okay? One, we see the impending death of the master. Two, the transfer of spirit to the disciple. Three, the presence of witnesses. Four, the actual death of the master. And five, the disciples' crossing of the Jordan River. Okay? Robert Alter had wrote, the biblical type scene occurs not in the rituals of daily existence, but at the critical junctures in the lives of the heroes, from conception and birth to betrothal and deathbed. We would call these secession scenes as the prophet's deathbed scenes. In other words, it's the last words that they say before they move on. Okay? So, if we turn the page, some of the things that we should be thinking about as we look at these two sections is how is Israel going to survive without these major prophets? How is Israel going to survive without Moses, right? The greatest prophet of them all. How is Israel going to survive without Elijah, the bringing of the Messianic era, right? Moses, as we know, is left on the other side of the Jordan. He's not allowed to cross into the Holy Land. That is Jordan's job, or Joshua's job, okay? Elijah's quest by God is actually to appoint a new king of Israel. He doesn't. In 1 Kings 19:15, Yahweh says to him, go back the way you came, and on the wilderness of Damascus, when you get there, anoint Hazael as king of Aram. He never does. Okay, in other words, the jobs of the prophets are not over, right? It's unfulfilled. There's the secession brings the rest of it forward, okay? The method in which we're going to look at these type scenes is a method we've used before in this class, and that is the idea of literary stations. We're going to push the texts and pull them into these stations so that we look at them under Dr. Haverlock's 5 thematic elements, okay? We're going to look at each one, see their comparisons or similarities, their differences, and sort of look at them together, and that will hopefully give us a little more information about this scene. And we'll see what we think about it, if we think that there is a great deal of similarity or not, okay? So if we turn to page 4, okay, real quick in terms of literary stations, before we even jump into this, Dr. Haverlock calls this type scenes. I would, from my teaching, you may have heard me speak about this in terms of the idea of a motif adaptation. We've talked about that with the sister wife, with the rock water, those sorts of things, so that we are reminded motif is an idea or theme that is repeated in various manners. A motif may involve more than just an idea. It can have a form. A motif may be a literary object that presents a particular theme in a particular form. And we can clarify the significance of the motif by contrasting it with what is often referred to, as we have heard before, the idea of literary trope. The latter is simply the turn of phrase or expression that functions at a non-literal level. A quick review on literary trope. On the third day is a literary trope, okay? It connotes a general notion of duration. 40 days is a literary trope. 7 days is a literary trope, okay? Those sort of, and God spoke to Moses saying, or, and then these things, you know, they are meant to click in our minds something that, you know, that does. The contemporary example that I always provide is the once upon a time, right? That is the literary trope that tells us what's coming in the same way, okay? So what we're going to do, and the motif, right, is we don't know, we can't recognize a motif until it is repeated, right? We need to have 2 of them in there to see, okay, I see these parts together, okay? Here they're referred to as type scenes, but it's the same sort of idea, okay? So let's take a look on the impending death of the master, okay? If we would, let's let's read again, so we got it in our heads here, the Moses and Joshua one. Someone want to read on the left column there, Deuteronomy 31:2, and then I've also put 31:16 in there as well.
He said to them, I am now 120 years old. I can no longer be active. Moreover, Yahweh said to me, you shall not go across yonder Jordan. Yahweh your God himself will cross over before you, and he himself will wipe out those nations from your path, and you shall dispossess them. Joshua is the one who shall cross before you. Yahweh has spoken.
Good. Keep going.
Yahweh said to Moses, you are soon to lie with your fathers. These people will thereupon go astray after the alien gods in their midst, in the land that they are about to enter. They will forsake me and break my covenant that I made with them.
Okay, in other words, this is all foreshadowing as to what's going to happen. Okay? Really interesting is if you read some of this and then some of the other verses, it seems that Moses is going through his own stages of grief here, okay? You know, the one where he says, I'm 100 years, that's sort of the acceptance of it, but we hear a lot of other things, right? Deuteronomy 1:37, he says, because of you, Yahweh was incensed with me too, and he said, you shall not enter it either. In other words, this is your fault that I can't go in. That was the, blame, right? Deuteronomy 3:23, he says, I pleaded with Yahweh at that time, saying, O Lord God, you who let your servant see the first works of your greatness, right? Let me pray, cross over, and see the good land. But Yahweh was wrathful with me, right? It's a great deal of denial and sort of like, well, this is Yahweh's fault, right? And then finally, the acceptance, right? I'm 100 years old, right? But you see Moses go through these his impending death he's aware of, right? This is to say nothing of the fact that if we ascribe to the idea that Moses wrote down the entire Torah with God whispering in his ear, he already knew he was going to die and what he was going to say and all that sort of stuff. So there's a great deal of impending of the death of the master. Okay. Elisha and Elijah. Someone want to read, remind us of this scene, 2 Kings 2:1 through 2:5.
Okay. When Yahweh was about to take Elijah up to heaven in a whirlwind, Elisha and Elisha had set out from Gilgal, 2 Kings. Disciples of the prophet at Bethel came out to Elisha and said to him, do you know that Yahweh will take your master away from you today? He replied, I know it too, be silent. From Kings 2:5, the disciples of the prophets who were at Jericho came over to Elisha and said to him, do you know that Yahweh will take your master away from you today? He replied, I know, I knew it too, be silent.
In other words,
They copied.
yeah, it's the same thing. Hey, everyone knows Elijah's about to die, okay? And this is the impending death moment, okay? They're walking along, okay? And we do that, okay? As we move forward, and we'll talk a little bit more about that situation when we get to the idea of the presence of witnesses, because that is also sort of having to do with that. But let's get to the transfer of the Spirit to the disciple, okay? So if we look at Deuteronomy 34:9, Joshua, son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him, and the Israelites heeded him, doing as Yahweh had commanded Moses. And Yahweh answered, single out Joshua, right? That's from Numbers, okay? So the Numbers one actually comes before him. Have him stand before Eleazar the priest and lay his hands on him, okay? So that is the transference, right? The laying of the hands. Now we see that as the smicha of becoming a rabbi. The laying, that's what it means, laying of hands, okay? So when you transfer authority into somebody else, okay? So that is the transfer there, okay? In the Elijah, Elisha, it's a little different. Let's take a look at 2 Kings 2:9. Someone want to read that for me?
As they were crossing, Elijah said to Elisha, tell me, what can I do for you before I am taken from you? Elisha answered, let a double portion of your spirit pass on to me. You have asked a difficult thing, he said. If you see me as I am being taken from you,
this will be granted to you. If not, it will not.
Okay, it's a little more, it's a little less direct, okay? Elisha parts the Jordan, okay? Parting of the sea doesn't just happen in Exodus, happens all the time, okay? By removing his cloak, rolling it up.
Not much of a sea.
Right. Well, yeah. And strikes the water.
It's a bigger prophet, because he did a bigger thing.
Right. At the same time, the crossing brings Elijah and Elisha to the proper site for that initiation. In other words, in order to get to where Elijah is going to die, they cross that over. Now, Elisha asks for a double portion of Elijah's spirit. Okay, this term, a double portion, we see it once before in Deuteronomy 21. In Deuteronomy 21:17, it says, "He must accept the firstborn, the son of the unloved one, and allot to him a double portion of all he possesses. Since he is the first fruit of his vigor, the birthright is his due." So the law in Deuteronomy that it's talking about is about a firstborn son getting double portion. Okay? So what we're seeing here is, instead of prophet and apprentice, we're seeing a father-son sort of thing. Like, I want a double portion because I'm like your firstborn, I'm like your heir. That's the connection here, okay? Now, take a look at how the transfer is supposed to take place, right? We're never told that Elisha receives this. We're never told that explicitly. He claims later his inheritance by actually taking the cloak, and we'll go over that. But take a look at what Elijah says. "If you see me as I am being taken from you, this will be granted. The double portion will be granted. If you don't, it will not." In other words, in a little bit, God's going to take me. If you witness it, you'll get the double portion. If God, for some reason, doesn't want you to see my ascension, you don't get the double portion, right? That's the rules of the game, okay? So that's the transfer of the spirit of the disciple. Question so far? We're going to get into the rest and whatever it is, but hopefully we're starting to see these type scenes come together a little bit, okay? So there's a build up to this, and there's an understanding a little bit here. And when we talk about transfer of spirit to the disciple, the relationship between the prophet and the attendant or the apprentice, right, it's a close one. Here, Elisha believes him to be the heir, the first son, sort of father-son relationship, right? Not in reality, but in practice. Okay.
There is no laying of hands.
Correct.
No formal.
Correct. That's true. No, that's true. The transfer is completely different, right? The style of transfer is completely different. Yet the spirit is transferred, right? And we'll see a little bit more as to the situations about that. But yes, that's correct. There's no laying of the hands on Elisha, right? There's no anointing, right? It's just a transfer of a jacket, really, a cloak, right? So a little bit different. So let's go into the presence of witnesses. Okay, someone want to read for me Numbers 27 through 22. And one thing I want to mention really quickly, let's see if I wrote notes on that. No, really quickly is you're seeing texts from Numbers and Deuteronomy for a reason. Okay, there's a transference, an initial transference in Numbers. And then way at the end of Deuteronomy, it's sort of finished, right? There is a great deal of what I think is a reason to believe that originally in Numbers 27, Moses died, right? It gets up to the very end and Moses dies, right? And the Deuteronomy, the book of Deuteronomy was added later, and it was sort of mushed together. That's why all of this stuff happens in Numbers 27. If you read Numbers 27, it looks like it's it. It's like a done deal. The fact that it happens again is a little bit strange. And we can go into that study another day, but it's really fascinating that in the original, this is where Moses died. But but then it just keeps going. So, someone want to read Numbers 27, and we'll get a hold of this presence of witnesses here.
Have them stand before Eleazar the priest and before the whole community and commission him in their sight. But he shall present himself to Eleazar the priest, who shall be on his behalf seek the decision of Urim before Yahweh. By such instruction to go out, and by such instruction they shall come in, he and all the Israelites, the whole community. Moses did as Yahweh commanded him. He took Joshua and had him stand before Eleazar the priest and before the whole community. He laid his hand upon him and commissioned him, as Yahweh has spoken through Moses.
Okay, wonderful. So a couple things to talk about this here. He laid his hands upon him, okay? I think it's singular, actually, in one of the manuscripts. Not hand, but hands. And Rashi, the 10th century rabbi, says that even though the text says hand, it means hands. Moses put his hands on. Okay, I think commission him in the site. Right. I think originally the first one, the request is singular, and Moses does the plural. Right. So it's lay your hand on Joshua. Moses lays both his hands on there. Rashi says he asks more generously. He lays both his hands on there, okay? Really important is the fact that the entire community is expected to be there to transfer this authority. That makes sense, right? The fact that everyone has to be there in order for it to take place. You can't just do it in the tent of meeting by yourself. Everyone has to witness this transference of spirit, okay? Another thing, Joshua's power is presented in front of Eleazar, the Kohanim, the priests. It needs to be double checked by that arm of that group, right? The holiness of the priests need to check on this, okay? One other thing to mention is that Joshua is not Moses' son, okay? Just like Elisha is not Elijah's son. And Moses did have children and did have sons. So this actually disrupts the transmission of Moses' priestly legacy to Joshua. So that's important to mention, okay? Let's look at the presence of witnesses, 2 Kings 6 and then 2 Kings 15. Someone else wants to read for me.
Elijah said to him, "Stay here, for Yahweh has sent me on to the Jordan. As Yahweh lives, as you live, I will not leave you," he said. And the two of them went on. 50 men of the disciples of the prophets followed and stood by at a distance from them as the two of them stopped at the Jordan. When the disciples of the prophet of Jericho saw him from a distance, they exclaimed, "The spirit of Elijah has settled on Elisha." And they went to meet him and bowed low before him to the ground. Okay,
same sort of thing. 50 men are there, right? And the disciples of the prophets are following them around, okay, to witness this. Again, it has to be in front of everyone, okay? Remember back in terms of the impending death, right, where they're saying, "Do you know that Yahweh is taking your master away?" Right? There's this almost competitive air to it, almost a mocking sort of air to it, right? Hey, your master is going away. Who are you going to be? This sort of thing, right? So there's this, the fulfilling of it becomes almost competitive, which is why you might view what Elisha is trying to do, right? Elijah says, "Stay here," right? He says, "Stay. I'm going to cross the Jordan." And Elisha says, "No, I'm coming with you. I want everyone to see this. I need to be there to do this." He's pushing himself and making sure that he's there, right, for this thing. Because you remember the rules, right? If you see my impending ascension or whatever it is, you get the double portion. If you don't, you don't. So if Elisha had stayed on the other side of the Jordan, maybe he wouldn't have seen it, right? So he's sort of taking it into his own way. Okay? Good?
Yep.
Good. Good. Okay. So let us continue to the death of the master. Someone want to read for me Deuteronomy 34:9.
Now Joshua, son of Nun, was filled with servant of Yahweh. Yahweh said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' attendant, my servant Moses is dead. Prepare to cross the Jordan, together with all this people, unto the land that I am giving to the Israelites.
Okay, wonderful. So real quick, just for funsies, let's go back to presence of witnesses on at the Moses-Joshua side. Numbers 27:22. Moses did as Yahweh commanded him. He took Joshua, had him stand before Eleazar the priest, and before the whole community. He laid his hands upon him and commissioned him as Yahweh had spoken through Moses. Then go to Joshua 1:1. After the death of Moses, the servant of Yahweh, Yahweh said to Joshua, my servant is dead. It's a wonderful transition. If you remove the book of Deuteronomy completely, the story is fine. Okay? So that's just a little thing to stick in your ear a little bit, okay? That being said, when it says after the death of Moses, Joshua 1:1, this is how the Nevi'im begins. This is how the book of the prophets begins, okay? They are devised specifically to create that link between the end of Deuteronomy, okay? It's meant so that you are, at that point, the redactors have gotten a hold of it, and you say, okay, the end of Deuteronomy, you're supposed to read Joshua next, okay? The beginning of the book is Joshua taking up Moses' task. Again, to note that Moses is called the servant of Yahweh, okay? It's a formal epithet for Moses. It's used in Deuteronomy, as we said. And Joshua is called his attendant. The implication is that the attendant of Yahweh's servant will now assume the role of the master. Okay, these words, the words are sort of important. In regards to the laying his hands upon him, that ritual is not, the rite behind it is not necessarily known. Now we use it as rabbinic ordination, as I said. But basically it was in some way to put the spirit into another person. But the smicha, the origin of that, as to why laying the hands, we're just not sure where it came from. That's from an unknown source.
Is it the same as the father is blessing the son with laying hands?
Yeah, later. Yeah. Yeah.
You have it in many other places, but in the family. So
Correct, right? You put your hand on them. Right, exactly. In 34:9, right, it says, Joshua, son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom. Okay? We think then, we envision like some visible spirit, like they could see it, right? That all of a sudden, Joshua was aglow or something, or there was some sort of transference of it, right? Otherwise, it's just a person laying his hand on him and nothing happens, right? So we imagine that there is this visible spirit. But, important to know that God does not address Joshua directly until after Moses dies. Okay? He talks a lot after Numbers and Deuteronomy, whatever, but only until it becomes a thing of the past does the actual transference complete itself. And God first addresses Joshua with the words Moses was dying to hear. Get up and cross the Jordan. In other words, Moses really wanted to cross the Jordan. The first things that God says to Joshua is prepare to cross the Jordan. So you can see a very streamlined timeline of Moses couldn't do it. The first thing you're going to do is keep going. Okay? 2 Kings 10, the death of the master, the death of Elijah. 2 Kings 10 through 14. Someone want to read us this great scene?
So that's the difficult thing. He said, if you see me as I have been taken from you, this will be granted to you. If not, it will not. As they kept on walking and talking, a fairy chariot with fairy horses suddenly appeared and separated one from the other, and Elijah went up to heaven in the whirlwind. As they kept on walking and talking, a fairy chariot with fairy horses suddenly appeared and separated one from the other, and Elijah went up to heaven in a whirlwind. Seems like he's copied it, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, Father, Father, Israel's chariots and horsemen. When he could no longer see him, he grasped his garments and rent them in two. He picked up Elijah's mantle, which had dropped from him, and he went back and stood at the banks of the Jordan.
Oh, I actually repeated one of the verses twice, sorry. 11 is twice, sorry. Okay, quite the scene, okay? So first of all, Elijah is not actually sure that Elisha is going to get his double portion, right? He says, look, if you see it, great. If God unveils his eyes to witness Elijah's ascension, that will be the proof of his worthiness. So Elijah doesn't actually know that, okay? The chariot of fire and horses of fire. Fire has been an important instrument in Elijah's prophetic activities, okay? So fire is a big thing. Elijah goes up in a whirlwind. This is completely new. We have never seen this before. Everywhere else in the Hebrew Bible, death is death. Death is the end, right? People go into a hole in the ground, or they die, or they're never seen, right? The idea of Elijah's ascension is the idea of being taken, okay? The only time we see this is being taken. We see this in Genesis 5 of Enoch. Enoch walked with God, and he was no more, for God took him. In other words, he didn't die. God took him. This is unfamiliar territory for us.
So Michael, this is saying that Elijah, Elisha, is going somewhere. That there's a
Elijah.
There's a place to go.
Sort of, right? We don't know. We're in unfamiliar territory here. Elijah doesn't die. He rides up to some celestial sphere in a fiery chariot. We've never seen this before. We have no idea where he's going,
It means
right?
that the fiery chariot and the horsemen, they come from somewhere too.
Also true, right? And they're his ride up to somewhere else, right? Moses doesn't get a fiery chariot ride, right? Moses dies, and that's it, okay? Elisha, as he sees this, refers to Elijah as father, right? It's again very paternal. And it says he picks up Elijah's coat, his thing, and he rents it, he rips it. Okay, the reversal, actually, well, in two ways. One, we rent our clothing when we're in mourning in Judaism, but also he requests a double portion, and he's holding half a garment. It's split, so it's sort of ironic. I don't know if the author's trying to be funny there or what, but the idea is he asks for a double portion, and he grasps his garment and rents them in two, so it's half. Elijah ascends to what we understand as immortality. The Jordan River, where a chariot of fire is drawn by horses of fire, touches down from somewhere, functions as a portal to heaven and a site of contact between human and divine. So a very big death scene. Elijah gets the full treatment, right? A chariot of fire that rides up into the heavens, right? So this is, I think, what leads to, besides the stuff in Malachi that we saw about Elijah will bring about the Messiah, is that Elijah doesn't go where everybody else goes. Elijah now has a role to play to come before the Messiah, and that's why he got his special ride up to that special place, whatever that is. So pretty big, pretty cool. So let's move on to the last part here. Disciples Jordan River crossing. Joshua 3:8 and 4:10 through 4:16, if you would.
For your part, command the priests to carry the ark of the covenant as follows. When you reach the edge of the water of the Jordan, make a hole in the Jordan. The priests who bore the ark remain standing in the middle of the Jordan until all the instructions that Yahweh had ordered Joshua to convey to the people had been carried out. And so the people speedily crossed over, just as Moses had assured Joshua in his charge to him. Command the priests who bear the ark of the pact to to come up out of the Jordan.
Okay, so he's about to cross over the Jordan, okay? And he's got the ark, okay? The Ark of the Covenant, the tabernacle, all right? It's got this, crazy theological aura around it, okay? One thing to mention is that God says, it says, the priests who bore the ark remained standing in the middle of the Jordan until all the instructions that Yahweh had ordered Joshua to convey to the people had been carried out. And so the people speedily crossed over, just as Moses had assured Joshua in his charge to him. Moses did not instruct Joshua about the procedure of the crossing of the Jordan. In fact, he had nothing to do with that. So that's a little puzzling to us. That particular clause does not appear in the Greek translation, the Septuagint. But the scribe may have said he wanted us to have a little reach back to Moses. But Moses doesn't tell him how to cross the river because Moses isn't going to do that. So very, very strange. It is not until the final step here of succession, the Jordan River crossing, that God publicly elevates Joshua before of all Israel and enables recognition that God accompanies Joshua as he did Moses. In other words, Joshua's term begins on the other side of the Jordan. He becomes the authoritative leader who then directs battles, communicates with gods, and exhorts the people to obey the tenets of Torah. Okay, so the crossing has some meaning. This is a transition. Okay, then we'll see that also in a moment when we look at 2 Kings 2:14. Okay, so let's read that part and see the similarities here.
Taking the mantle which had dropped from Elijah, he struck the water and said, "Where is Yahweh, the God of Elijah?" As he too struck the water, it parted to the right and to the left, and Elisha crossed over it. When the disciples of the prophets at Jericho saw him from a distance, they exclaimed, "The spirit of Elijah has settled on Elisha." And they went to meet him and bowed low before him to the ground.
Okay, so Elijah is taken. Elisha takes his coat, right? Does the same thing that Elijah does. Strikes the water, right? He's checking. Did he get the rose, right? Did he become the next prophet? And he yells out, "Where is Yahweh, the God of Elijah?" Right? If God's supposed to be with him, right? Just like God was with Elijah, Elisha should be able to replicate those miracles. He's testing it out to see, okay? One other real quick note about the syntax. As he too struck the water. Where is Yahweh, the God of Elijah? As he too struck the water. It's sort of, in the Hebrew, it's a glitch in Hebrew syntax. It should appear as "and he struck." In the Hebrew, it looks like "he too and he struck." So I love pointing out those little syntax errors in the holy documents. But anyway, we have to find out. We actually never are told explicitly, like we said, does Elisha inherit that double spirit? He's got the cloak in his hand. He returns to the edge of the Jordan and imitates Elijah, striking the water with it. And he calls out, "Where is Yahweh?" He solicits the divine aid and brings himself into a relation with his master's God. I'd like to mention the similarities to Joshua here, who was first addressed by God on the eastern shore, right? To the next side, all of a sudden, he needs to cross for it to occur, okay? According to another scholar, Herman Gunkel, Elisha's ability to miraculously ford the Jordan proves that Elijah's power has passed to him, and that a marvel could be transferred from tradition from one man of God to another. When it does split, right, that's the proof that we get that And he gets to the other side, and the 50 disciples who've been mocking him say, okay, it's you, you're the guy now, right? That's the thing. So there is something that we see, looking at this as a whole, right? If we're looking at the transference from one prophet to another, right, a master to a disciple, there's buildup, there's the impending death, right, all the things, will he, won't he, all that sort of stuff. There's the actual transfer itself, some sort of ritual or act, if it's laying the hands on or if it's witnessing something that has to transfer into the next person. The presence of witnesses is extremely important for the same reason that all kinds of things throughout the Torah are, and in the Tanakh, are done in the presence of other people, right? When Moses condemns people, it's in the presence of people, right? All of this is to make sure that everybody knows this is the next guy, okay? This is the next person. The death of the master, it happens, right? Moses dies and Elijah kind of dies, but they are definitely gone, right? And then the final step, which is really so interesting, the final step before God actually says, okay, you're that, is the crossing of a river, the crossing of the Jordan specifically. Both of it is the crossing of the Jordan, okay? So there is some symbolism hidden inside these to say that, you know, Joshua is addressed a little bit on the east side, but when he gets to the west side, all of a sudden he's this big guy. Elisha has to get across and go to the other side until other people recognize. Really fascinating. So, what do we think about these motif adaptions and type scenes? What do we think of what we learned today?
Does this continue to repeat? These three situations have these similarities, and then are there prophets after that this continues?
Not really. There isn't really that strong of a type scene in the other prophets throughout the rest of the Tanakh, right? They're there, they die, or whatever it is. But these are the moments where we actually see a succession of spirit from one to the other. So no, it's not seen a great deal, or repeated a great deal. These are the two sort of big ones that occur.
So then the people then can, showing my ignorance here, but the people then can question the other prophets more horrifically because there wasn't a witness, there wasn't a certain success.
Yeah, right, and we go back to Deuteronomy 18, right, is how do you tell who's the real prophet? Deuteronomy tells us, right? Does it come true? Okay, he was a prophet. Does it not come true? You know, but you're right. You know, the other thing that we see is miracles that occur, right? There's lots of prophets who do miracles, and so miracles is also a big sort of, you know, light bulb to pop in and say, okay, that's someone special. But yes.
According to this definition, who is a prophet and who is not, what about Jonah?
Yeah.
Prophecy that...
His prophecy does not come true.
Yeah,
that is true. And he gets angry about it because of that, right? He by God reversing that, right? He says, you're making me look like I'm not a prophet, right? I mean, he gets mad. Because you're right. You know, the idea is, in order to prove that I'm a prophet, it should have come true. The fact that you change your mind now makes me look bad. So that's why Jonah is upset about it. That's right. That's right. Absolutely. Yeah. But yes, but different author, different different agenda. But yes, I think that's important to note. What else, friends, did we take from this?
It's interesting. You can actually, I know this, we're learning about Judaism, but the New Testament was written mainly by Jewish people, and you can apply that to the death scene of Jesus.
So
Exactly.
yes, there is
I'd
a
imagine they did that because they had to think, well, how are we going to make this a prophet? Well,
right.
This is what we need. We need this. Okay.
Right.
And you've got exactly that. You've got, everyone knew he was going to die because he was on the cross.
Right.
And he transferred it over to John because John was, and the witnesses were there, and then he dies.
As a matter of
He was
fact,
a prophet.
right, Dr. Haverlock in her book, I didn't mention, of course, because I didn't want to go into that aspect, but she does derive that parallel specifically to John the Baptist, to that idea. So to Pam's question, in our Bible, it does not happen, but in the New Testament, they use the same structure in terms of typology. So yes, and I'm glad you could see that. And her easily, right? And that's the idea of a motif, right? Adaptation is that it should be obvious to the reader, right? When a Christian reads this secession scene, they should say, wait a minute, this was Moses Joshua, this was, right? That's the point of it, right? That's the smartness of it. Correct.
We're appealing to other Jewish people. How are we going to make this appeal to them? Well, they'll know that this is what has to happen.
The motif and the type scene, the literary trope should all be recognizable. So correct, yes, nice work, yes. Or good on you, as you tell me. Yeah. What else, friends? Questions or comments on our lesson today?
Well, when Muhammad dies, there's a split who takes over, and there's been a split for 1,000 years. So.
Yeah, you're right. There's no laying of hands as to the next one. Same with Chabad, right? After the Rebbe dies, there's no one else. So these type scenes are important, right? In terms of who gets the next leadership. Not to say that it hasn't happened before, as we pointed out, right? And the other prophets are just there. You know, there's no secession for them, right?
Thank you very much.
Yes. You're welcome. All right, friends. Thank you very much for your thoughts and your comments and questions. Thank you.
You get to go home now, Michael?
I do get to go home. I've been here since 9 o'clock. I do get to go home. Hooray.